Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about the war in Ukraine. They assume this is fundamentally a conflict about ideology, about democracy versus authoritarianism, or about one man's imperial ambitions. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? The Western narrative has been remarkably consistent on this point for nearly 3 years now. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how great power competition actually works. This isn't primarily about Putin's psychology or NATO expansion or historical grievances, though all of those elements are real. This is about something far more fundamental and far more permanent. This is about geography. And once you understand the geographic imperatives that have shaped Russian strategic thinking for centuries, you realize that the outcome in Ukraine was never really in doubt. Not because Russia is militarily superior in some overwhelming sense, and not because Ukrainian resistance isn't genuine or fierce, but because Russia cannot afford to lose Ukraine, and that inability is written into the physical landscape of Eastern Europe in ways that transcend any particular leader or political moment. Most people hear Russia can't lose and assume that's a prediction about battlefield outcomes or a commentary on relative military strength. It's neither. It's a statement about geographic necessity and what happens when a great power faces an existential geographic vulnerability. The question isn't whether Russia has the capacity to occupy all of Ukraine indefinitely or whether it can achieve some kind of clear military victory in conventional terms. The question is whether Russia can accept a Ukraine that sits firmly in the Western security architecture, hosting NATO infrastructure integrated into European defense planning and functioning as a forward operating base for the very alliance Russia views as its primary strategic threat. And the answer, when you look at the actual map, when you understand the geographic logic that has driven Russian strategic culture for 300 years, is no. Russia cannot accept that outcome, which means Russia will continue this conflict in one form or another until that outcome becomes impossible. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what geography actually represents in strategic planning. Most contemporary analysis treats geography as background context, something to mention briefly before moving on to the important stuff like weapon systems, tactics, political will, or economic resources. But that's backwards. Geography is the foundation. Everything else builds on top of it. And for Russia, the geographic reality is brutally simple. Russia is the largest country on Earth by landmass, but it has remarkably few natural defensive barriers. No mountain ranges protecting the core. No wide oceans providing separation from potential adversaries. Just vast expanses of relatively flat terrain that have served as invasion routes for centuries. The Mongols came across these plains. Napoleon came across these plains. Hitler came across these plains. And every single time, the Russian response has been the same. Push the border as far west as possible, create strategic depth, establish buffer zones, control the territory between the heartland and the threat. This is what historians and strategists call the Russian security dilemma. But that phrase doesn't quite capture the visceral geographic anxiety that shapes decision-making in Moscow. Think of it this way. If you're France, you have the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Mediterranean on another, the Pyrenees Mountains blocking Spain, and the Alps creating a natural fortress on your southeastern border. An invasion of France requires crossing serious natural obstacles that dramatically favor the defender. If you're the United States, you have two massive oceans separating you from every major power center on Earth. Your neighbors to the north and south pose no strategic threat. You can project power globally while remaining virtually immune to invasion at home. This geographic advantage is so overwhelming that Americans often don't even consciously recognize it. It's just the water we swim in. But Russia has none of that. Moscow sits roughly 400 miles from the current NATO border. There are no mountain ranges in between, no major rivers that couldn't be bridged, just flatland. And throughout Russian history, every time that flat corridor has been left uncontrolled, eventually someone has come through it with an army. This creates what you might call a geographic imperative. Russia must control the approaches to the heartland or accept permanent vulnerability to invasion from the West. That's not ideology. That's not Putin's personal paranoia. That's the consistent strategic logic that has driven Russian expansion and defensive positioning since the rise of Muscovy. Now fast forward to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. Almost overnight, Russia's western border shifts hundreds of miles eastward. The buffer zones are gone. The Warsaw Pact evaporates. And then beginning in 1999, NATO starts expanding east. First Poland, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Then in 2004, the big wave brings in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria. By 2009, Croatia and Albania join. Every single expansion moves the Western security architecture closer to the Russian core. And here's what makes this particularly significant from a Russian strategic perspective. Many of these new members are former Soviet republics or Warsaw Pact states. The buffer zone isn't just shrinking, it's inverting. Territory that once provided strategic depth is now hosting the infrastructure of the opposing alliance. Ukraine represents the final major piece of that buffer zone. It's not just about size, though Ukraine is the largest country entirely in Europe by land area, roughly 233,000 square miles. It's about position. Ukraine sits directly between Russia and the NATO members in Eastern Europe. If Ukraine joins NATO, if it hosts alliance bases and missile defense systems, if it becomes integrated into Western military planning, then the NATO border runs along a 1,200-mile frontier with Russia proper. More importantly, that frontier includes direct access to the North European plain, the historic invasion route. There is no fallback position, no secondary defensive line. The threat is at the gate. Let me walk you through exactly how this geographic logic translates into strategic necessity, because the architecture is actually three separate dynamics running simultaneously, each reinforcing the others. First, there's the defensive depth problem. Military planners use a general rule of thumb about defense in depth. You want multiple layers between your core territories and potential adversaries. This allows for absorption of initial attacks, buying time for mobilization, creating opportunities to counterattack before the enemy reaches critical infrastructure or population centers. For Russia, Ukraine provides that layer. Without Ukraine under at least neutral status, preferably under Russian influence, Moscow is defending the indefensible. The distance from the Ukrainian border to Moscow is about 300 miles. That's less than the distance from New York City to Pittsburgh. For a modern military force, that's nothing. Airstrikes can cover that distance in minutes. Ground forces could advance it in days under the right conditions. Second, there's the nuclear calculation, and this is where it gets genuinely difficult. Russia's nuclear deterrent depends on strategic depth for the ground-based component. Mobile missile launchers, command and control infrastructure, early warning systems all require territory to disperse across, to make targeting difficult, to ensure survivability even under first strike scenarios. When NATO moves closer, when the warning time decreases, when potential adversaries have strike capabilities positioned on your immediate border, the entire calculus of nuclear deterrence shifts. Russia's second strike capability becomes more vulnerable. That vulnerability creates pressure for more aggressive nuclear posture, for launch on warning doctrines, for increased alert status. These aren't wild speculations. This is basic nuclear strategy. When you compress the geographic buffer, you compress the decision timeline, and compressed timelines increase the likelihood of catastrophic miscalculation. Third, and this is something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in Western analysis, there's the resource security dimension. Ukraine sits astride multiple critical transportation corridors connecting Russia to Europe. Natural gas pipelines, oil routes, rail connections all run through Ukrainian territory. Beyond that, Ukraine possesses some of the most fertile agricultural land on earth, the famous black soil that has made it a breadbasket for centuries. It has significant mineral deposits, industrial capacity, and a population of over 40 million people, most of whom speak Russian as either first or second language. From Moscow's perspective, allowing Ukraine to fully integrate into Western economic and security structures means losing access to all of that permanently. Now add to this something that makes the Ukrainian situation particularly unsettling to strategic planners in Moscow. Ukraine isn't just buffer territory. It's the historical and cultural heartland of the Eastern Slavic world. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, was the center of Kievan Rus, the medieval federation that Russians view as the origin point of their own civilization. The idea of Ukraine as fundamentally separate from Russia, as a distinct nation with a different trajectory, is relatively recent in historical terms and deeply controversial within Russian elite thinking. This isn't to justify anything or to deny Ukrainian identity and self-determination. It's to explain the psychology. For many in Moscow, Ukraine joining NATO isn't just a strategic setback. It's civilizational amputation. Stay with me here because this is where the framework I mentioned earlier clicks into place. What we're watching in Ukraine is a textbook example of what international relations scholars call a security dilemma, but with a specifically geographic component that makes resolution almost impossible through normal diplomatic channels. A security dilemma occurs when actions one state takes to increase its own security inevitably decrease the security of other states, creating a spiral of countermeasures that leaves everyone worse off. NATO expansion, from the Western perspective, is purely defensive. These countries joined voluntarily because they feared Russian aggression. They wanted the Article 5 guarantee. They wanted integration into Western institutions. From their standpoint, this is about their security and their choice. But from the Russian perspective, every eastward expansion of NATO looks like encirclement, looks like preparation for eventual confrontation, looks like the West taking advantage of Russian weakness in the 1990s to permanently constrain Russian power. And here's the trap. Russia's response to NATO expansion, attempting to maintain buffer zones through influence operations, frozen conflicts, and when necessary direct military intervention. This response confirms Western fears that Russia is aggressive and expansionist, which justifies further NATO expansion, which provokes further Russian reaction. The spiral feeds itself. But the geographic component makes this security dilemma different from the typical examples you'd find in international relations textbooks. Most security dilemmas can theoretically be resolved through credible commitments, verification mechanisms, mutual transparency, and arms control agreements. You can verify that tanks aren't massing at the border. You can monitor military exercises. You can establish communication hotlines and incident prevention protocols, but you can't change geography. You can't move Ukraine 500 miles to the south where it stops being strategically critical. You can't create mountain ranges that don't exist. The physical reality of the North European plain and Russia's exposure through it is permanent. This means that even if you had perfect information, even if both sides completely trusted each other's intentions, the geographic logic would still create tension. As long as Ukraine could potentially host NATO infrastructure, Russia faces the defensive depth problem. As long as Russia views control, or at least neutralization of Ukraine as existential, Ukraine's own security requires alignment with a power strong enough to deter Russian pressure. There's no stable equilibrium. Every possible outcome that provides security for one side degrades security for the other. Let me give you a specific example of how this plays out at the operational military level. Imagine NATO membership for Ukraine becomes reality. Alliance forces begin installing missile defense systems in western Ukraine. The official purpose is defensive, protection against potential Russian strikes. But missile defense installations are dual-use infrastructure. The same systems that shoot down incoming missiles can be retooled or supplemented to launch offensive strikes with very little warning time. More critically, these systems gather intelligence, track Russian missile tests, map Russian early warning networks. From Moscow's perspective, even purely defensive NATO infrastructure in Ukraine represents a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. Now think about what happens from the Russian military planning standpoint. Previously, Russian strategic doctrine could assume that any NATO attack would require a visible buildup period. Forces would need to concentrate in Poland or the Baltic states. Supply lines would need to be established. The intelligence signatures would be obvious weeks or even months in advance, providing time for Russian countermeasures, strategic dispersal, diplomatic intervention, or if necessary, preemptive action. But if NATO infrastructure exists in Ukraine, if alliance forces are already positioned along the 1,200-mile border, that warning time compresses dramatically. A coordinated strike package could be assembled and launched before Russia could effectively respond. This compression of warning time doesn't just affect military planning, it affects crisis stability. During periods of tension, when rhetoric heats up, when smaller incidents occur, the side with less strategic depth and less warning time faces enormous pressure to act preemptively. If you believe a strike might be coming and you know that waiting even a few hours could mean the difference between effective defense and catastrophic vulnerability, the incentive to strike first becomes overwhelming. This is the classic danger of crisis instability, and geographic compression makes it worse. Here's another factor that deserves serious attention. Russia's demographic trajectory makes the Ukrainian question more acute, not less. Russia's population is aging and in many regions declining. The Russian Russian economy, while more resilient than many Western analysts predicted, remains heavily dependent on natural resource exports and struggles with long-term structural challenges. Military manpower is constrained. The defense industrial base, while ramping up production, cannot compete with the combined output of NATO members if that alliance commits to a sustained arms competition. In other words, Russia is operating from a position of underlying weakness, masked by nuclear weapons and residual Soviet military infrastructure. This weakness creates a temporal urgency. If Russia is going to secure its buffer zones, if it's going to prevent Ukraine from fully joining the Western Bloc, it needs to act while it still has the capability to do so. Waiting 10 or 20 years likely means operating from an even weaker position. There's also the question of precedent and credibility within Russia's immediate sphere of influence. If Ukraine successfully defects to the West despite Russian opposition, what message does that send to other post-Soviet states? Kazakhstan, with its large Russian-speaking population and extended border with Russia, the Central Asian republics that Russia views as its southern buffer, even Belarus, currently aligned with Moscow, but watching the Ukraine situation closely. If the West can pull Ukraine out of Russian orbit, despite everything Moscow has done to prevent it, then Russian influence everywhere becomes questionable. Great powers, especially those in perceived decline, cannot afford to lose contests over core interests without inviting challenges across their entire sphere. Now layer on top of that the question of sunk costs and domestic political logic within Russia. The war in Ukraine has cost Russia tremendously. Tens of thousands of casualties, economic sanctions, international isolation, reputational damage. The modernized military that Russia spent 2 decades building has been ground down in attritional warfare. If Russia walks away from Ukraine without achieving something that can be presented as strategic victory, all of those costs were for nothing. More than that, the domestic political narrative that has sustained the war effort collapses. Putin's entire legitimacy framework since 2022 has been built on the necessity of the Ukraine operation, the existential threat from NATO, the defense of Russian-speaking populations. A defeat or even a compromise that leaves Ukraine in the Western camp would be politically devastating internally. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not a chaotic and unpredictable situation. What you see is a very deliberate geographic trap, a trap built not through active manipulation, but through the collision of incompatible security requirements rooted in physical geography. Russia cannot accept a Ukraine that fully joins NATO because the geographic vulnerability that creates is existential. Ukraine cannot remain in a neutral gray zone because that leaves it permanently vulnerable to Russian pressure and occasional intervention. The West cannot abandon Ukraine without signaling that great powers can still violate sovereignty and redraw borders through force. None of these positions are particularly negotiable because each side views its core security as at stake. Project this forward, and what you see is several possible trajectories, none of them comfortable. The first possibility is a frozen conflict that becomes the new normal. Russia controls eastern and southern Ukraine, establishing a land bridge to Crimea and ensuring that whatever remains of Ukrainian state cannot join NATO as long as territorial disputes persist. This is essentially the Cyprus model, the Korea model, the Moldova model. Unresolved conflict that prevents integration into rival alliance structures. It's ugly, it's unstable, but it achieves the minimum Russian objective of keeping Ukraine out of NATO. The second possibility is continued escalation until one side's position becomes untenable. Either Western support for Ukraine wavers under the pressure of sustained costs, domestic political changes, or competing priorities elsewhere in the world, allowing Russia to impose a settlement, or Russian military capacity degrades to the point where maintaining the current operation becomes impossible, forcing Moscow to accept some version of Ukrainian sovereignty and Western orientation. The problem with this trajectory is that the stakes are high enough that before accepting defeat, either side might escalate in dangerous ways. For Russia, that escalation could mean expanded operations targeting Western supply lines, infrastructure strikes in NATO countries supporting Ukraine, or even limited nuclear use to demonstrate resolve. The third possibility, and this is where it gets genuinely concerning for the broader international system, is that the conflict becomes a protracted drain that accelerates systemic fragmentation. The war continues for years. Russia becomes progressively more aligned with China and other non-Western powers. Europe Europe faces sustained energy and economic pressures, the United States commits resources to Ukraine that could otherwise counter Chinese moves in the Pacific. Global South countries increasingly view the Western-led order as selective in its principles, defending Ukrainian sovereignty while ignoring Palestinian, Yemeni, or Syrian suffering. The rules-based international order that has structured global politics since 1945 erodes not through dramatic collapse, but through steady defection and disillusionment. What makes all of this particularly significant is that Ukraine is not an isolated case. The same geographic logic that makes Ukraine existential for Russia applies elsewhere with different specifics. China's determination to control Taiwan, to ensure no hostile power can threaten the approaches to the Chinese coast, to prevent encirclement by U.S. alliances. This follows similar geographic imperatives. Turkey's interventions in Syria and Libya, its confrontations with Greece over maritime boundaries and resources, these reflect geographic vulnerabilities and opportunities specific to Turkey's position. Iran's support for proxies throughout the Middle East, its determination to prevent hostile forces from dominating the Persian Gulf, again geographic logic. The post-Cold War era convinced many Western strategists that geography had become less important, that economic interdependence, international institutions, and technological change had fundamentally altered how states think about security. But what we're seeing in Ukraine, and what we're likely to see in other contested regions, is that geography still constrains and channels great power behavior in ways that ideology and economics cannot override. Russia can't lose Ukraine because Russia's geographic position makes Ukrainian orientation an existential question. That's not a statement about battlefield outcomes in 2024 or 2025. It's a statement about the underlying structural logic that will drive Russian strategic behavior regardless of who leads in Moscow or what political system Russia operates under. The real question is not whether Russia can win in some decisive sense or whether Ukraine can expel all Russian forces. The question is whether the international system can accommodate the reality that some territories sit at the intersection of incompatible security requirements, and whether we have any mechanism other than prolonged violence to resolve those contradictions. Because right now, we don't, and that's a pattern that extends far beyond Ukraine. So, the next time you hear analysis about Ukrainian battlefield gains or Russian tactical retreats or Western aid packages, try holding all of these things together in the same frame. The specific battles matter, the weapons deliveries matter, the diplomatic initiatives matter, but underneath all of it, the geographic imperatives that make Ukraine existentially important to Russia haven't changed. They can't change. And that fundamental reality will continue shaping this conflict long after the current phase ends, long after the headlines move elsewhere, long after people stop paying attention. Empires do not abandon core strategic territories because of temporary setbacks. They adjust, they adapt, they accept costs that would seem irrational to powers operating from positions of geographic security. And right now, the conditions that lock Russia into that calculation are assembling with remarkable permanence.